Greetings to the viewers, one and all, and greetings to my guest, Dr. Nick. Nick
You.
Spencer. Good to see you. Um, yeah, Dr. Nicholas Spencer is a name that doesn't require introductions, at least for the people who are very uh, familiar with the landscapes of science and religion. But for those who don't know him or have heard of his name but don't know where to look for him, uh, Nick's latest affiliation is with Theos, where he is a senior fellow. And you see there some of his books listed. And since I'm here, just before giving him the floor, I want to tell a funny story. Some of you, I'm talking to the viewers, might know that I co-edit the ISCAS journal Christian Perspectives on Science and Technology. And while we are about to conclude the third volume of the relaunched journal, because the journal existed for many years, it was relaunched, and so there's plenty article there. But what's interesting, and that this is funny, a funny detail I shared with Nick, who didn't know this. Uh, he's the star of our book reviews section. He, his 2023 book, uh, Magisteria, is the object of, well, this is the latest, yeah, this is the latest. It's an opinion piece or a new section of the journal inaugurated last year. I think it's called Opinions and Responses or something like that. So this is the latest. No, sorry. This is the a large review essay by James Unguranu, whom I noticed you quote from time to time. Okay, now so this is the latest, yeah, opinion response. Uh, Frank Nicholas from the University of Sydney. So it's somehow a synthesis of or an engagement of previous book reviews, but also there's original stuff in Frank's approach. And then look at this. Oh, okay, that's a different story. So there's like four engagements, book review size, and a big review essay for those who might wonder why my enthusiasm for having Nick as a guest, and also there's a fairly recent book review of Nick's more recent work with Hannah Waite, uh, playing God, which is a concept that I found again in the latest book, sorry, except cookies, whatever, uh, The Landscapes of Science and Religion. What are we disagreeing about? Nick Spencer, Hannah Waite. It's great to put a face and a voice uh, to the name. And it's my pleasure and my honor to host you, Nick. Welcome.
You. That's a very, very kind introduction, Doru. I'm flattered.
Ah, no, well, you're a name among us Aussies. Well, I'm not quite true blue, see my eyes, the color of my eyes. But anyway, I'm getting there, I think. So that's that's how real Aussies call themselves, true blue. Okay, so yeah, Nick was kind enough to point me to his and his colleagues' latest book, The Landscapes of Science and Religion. And while I have to apologize for not having been able to read more than the introduction, which I did with a lot of enthusiasm. I am really blown away. A new concept. Uh, Whoever believed that something new can pop up in the landscape or landscapes or territories or the history of science and religion, but there you have it. There's something fundamentally wrong, and you show a few things uh, to that effect, at least if I got you right, and your colleague, in the approach or the standard approach in science and religion with what you call essentialism, where you take the concepts of science and religion as well established, axiomatically so. We don't need to ponder further the concepts, and all of a sudden there are cracks in the wall. And you have shown some of these cracks in your Magisteria, and I haven't read the other one, Playing God, but I noticed that you return and with a new sort of with new energy, if you like, uh, to dismantling the idea that anything is as established as we thought it was. Um, and before I actually give you the floor, I read with so much interest towards the end of the introduction the shift. So you presented the landscape, so not the history of science and religion. So not to confuse our viewers with these terms. The history of science and religion, various approaches, various attempts at sort of revamping or reinventing the field, the very useful distinction between the academic go at science and religion and, let's say, the popular interest in conversations or whatever, the entanglement of scientific and religious ideas in our day and age, and so on and so forth. And then you addressed in depth uh, Peter Harrison's um, idea of territories, which I noticed you favor, in that it shifts the ground by showing that what we meant beforehand by science and religion as essentially distinct and clear concepts, it's not so distinct and clear insofar as the territories themselves kept shifting in history. Then you had that Wittgensteinian interlude that helped you slide towards your new concept of landscapes. And why it clicked with me, it's because of at some point I showed a book review, yeah, in the same ISCAS journal, Christian Perspectives on Science and Religion. I wrote last year on a book, which, by the way, you don't quote in this one, Chris Knight's Eastern Orthodoxy and the Science Theology Dialogue, where Chris Knight somehow addresses a similar concern when he says, well, we kept talking about science and religion, and by religion we understood classical, say, Western theism. And he says, I think the time has come to look at the topic from a different perspective. And given that he's an astrophysicist and an Orthodox priest, or Orthodox Christian priest, he said, I'll be looking at this story or revisit the history from the viewpoint of my own Christian tradition. And then I thought this was what you are actually doing, and to such a large scale in this book, co-authored with Waite, and talking about landscapes as the view from within, which is amazing. So this is something that sort of does away with the very generalizing science and religion terminology, and it's a matter of looking at the situation on the ground, so to speak. Location, 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 and they say military jargon, which is something that I make fun of. I don't quote because I like it. Uh, but the idea is that yes, we need to ground everything in reality. And one more thing, I thought that this was such a fortunate and useful and necessary return to the topic or reconsideration of the topic, which somehow reminded me of something that happened some maybe decades ago in a very different area, Mediterranean studies. There was this guy, Brodel, I think, Fernand Brodel, who wrote a story about the Mediterranean as a homogeneous space, your essentialism, you know. It's all Mediterranean. Everyone is Mediterranean, from Spain to Lebanon and Gaza. It's all one Mediterranean. And then the shift to what they call microecologies in uh, Purcell and his colleague, I forgot the name. So too early for me. I should sip more coffee. Mm. Um, and they depicted a very different Mediterranean, one that is made of locality, made of regional, whatever, entangled connections. And I think key concept that they use there is that of microecology, uh, which blows away all these essentialist Mediterranean homogeneous whatever narrative. Sorry for this lengthy introduction, but I wanted to let you know that I click with your approach and I'm eager to hear more. I'm certain our viewers will do so and they will bash me for talking for so long.
Well, thank you. You pinpoint Peter Harrison quite correctly as a huge influence on my thinking and B, a starting point for this work. I read his brilliant book, The Territories of Science and Religion, which probably came out about 7 years ago now, 7 or 8 years ago now, and was really struck by it. I've been a fan of his work for a long time, and this was no exception in terms of the erudition and precision it showed. And for viewers and listeners who don't know it, Peter is an intellectual historian, and The Territories of Science and Religion makes the point that it is meaningless to say that science and religion have been historically in opposition with one another, because science and religion didn't exist, historically speaking. And the human activities that we now subsume under each of those categories, science and religion, they existed in the past. Humans have studied nature, if you like. Humans have worshipped, just to take two examples, forever, but they weren't known as science or religion. And he uses the metaphor of territories to try and delineate shifting territories, how our concepts have shifted and changed over the years, so that by the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, which is when his book ends, we have what he calls reasonably established and recognizable categories of what science is and what religion is. And I think that's all correct, absolutely right. However, it seems to me that even though, if you like, the dictionary definition of science and of religion is reasonably settled by the end of the 19th century, although it's always being a dictionary definition, always changing, that doesn't actually mean that when we are even today talking about what science is and what religion is, we are necessarily talking about the same thing. We're necessarily talking about identifiable realities. You can illustrate this by looking at the fact that some people, like, for example, Richard Dawkins on the one hand and Ken Ham on the other hand, a creationist on the other hand, are fundamentally in agreement that science and religion, or in this case, evolution and the Bible, are incompatible. Both of them would say that, but they understand fundamentally different things of each of those categories, and they obviously accord very different truth statuses to them. So the launching off point for the landscapes of science and religion was to try and understand what we are actually talking about today when we're talking about science and what we're talking about when we're talking about religion. The essential, the underlying philosophical problem can be reasonably clearly stated. Language is discrete, reality is continuous. Science is a discrete word, religion is a discrete word. It has a kind of, in theory, a border to it. But of course, reality is continuous, and therefore the two rub up against one another. So it was an attempt to try and understand what we are talking about and therefore what we are disagreeing about when we talk about science and religion. And one other point before I let you come back in, the purpose of landscapes was twofold, really. It was really, as you mentioned, there's the first chapter, the introductory chapter, draws on the late philosophy of Wittgenstein in various different ways, the philosophy of language, and uses the, I think, very important fact that you understand the meaning of words through the way they are used. It talks about language as usage. So at the heart of our book is over 100 interviews with leading scientists and philosophers and sociologists and theologians and religious studies academics and communicators and so on and so forth to understand how those words are used. So it's a view from the ground level, and that was why we called it landscapes rather than territories, because territories is usually the word you would use for viewing something from above, as in a map. Whereas you view a landscape when you're in a landscape, and the book places us, as it were, within this landscape. And when you stare out into a landscape, you don't see boundaries, you don't see borders, you see different features within the landscape. And that was the metaphor that we then used to draw out how these two entities, for want of a better word, relate to one another.
Mm, yeah, very useful. And I noticed this shift of perspective from, let's say, the ultra view, uh, essentialist, generalist, um, non-bordered or confined idea of either science or religion or their interaction, for that matter, to this particular focused ground level, let's call it even grassroots level approach to what the two words mean and then their interaction. But before I let you go to some details, and I'd like to hear more about this view from below. Yeah, a question. I was reading that introductory chapter and said, okay, so I understand. Yes, essentialism uh, could lead you so far, and my earlier reference to Chris Knight sort of tells me that I should adopt a different view. And instead of talking about religion in general, or even Christianity in general, I should place myself within a certain framework, let's call it traditional framework, a worldview, and so on and so forth, which is very particular. And even there, perhaps dig deeper, and instead of talking about, in my case, Orthodox Christianity, I should talk about how Romanian Orthodox Christians look at things, how the Greeks look at things, and so on and so forth. And I wonder if, with this recovery of the ground level realities, we are still not supposed to combine the two perspectives. Just a moment to give you a bit of background. I worked for the last, well, sort of 10 years roughly, more or less continuously on Clement of Alexandria and his theory of nature contemplation. And yeah, I managed to finish a book. It doesn't matter now. Um, it's uh, it's something that I found there when he talks about looking at the world, because as you say at some point in the book, uh, regardless of what we might think of science or religion, uh, there are still two ways of looking at this world, at reality, our reality. Yeah. And Clement has this, or so I understood him, has this thing of bringing up two ways of looking at the same reality. The idea isn't new, and the first time I found it is in an article published some years back, 20 perhaps or more years back, by Laura Riserio on Clement, and she mentioned there that he was looking at reality from two vantage points. Uh, let's call them with terms that more or less say something to us, natural and supernatural. In other words, this disciplinary ground level kind of analysis of nature, and let's call it again the ultra view from above viewpoint. And Riserio said some, well, she didn't say much about how these two might connect. In my recently finished book, I try to say that actually we need them and we need to adopt a complementarian kind of understanding of what Clement does. I wonder, while I repeat, I give you that it's very important to realize what things really are on the ground, and this is something that was missing in the previous narrative. Do we still need something like uh, an encounter of the two views, the essentialist view, um, or more general science and religion, or the more concrete, grounded view that you are advocating in the book?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is you do need both. You have to have both. I mean, I would like to say a good word for essentialism because it is, so to speak, as it were, essential in and of itself. Now, in one sense, the entire book is an argument against essentialism when it comes to science and religion, and it's an extended process of disaggregation, effectively. The word disaggregate appears quite a few times in the text because that's what we're doing. We're pulling apart these concepts of science and religion. When you start doing that, you never actually stop. So, to take one example, through our discussions with our interviewees, we drew out what we call 6 different dimensions that comprise science. So there's a method, subject, presupposition, objectives, values, and institutional structure. I won't go through all of those, but just take the first one, method. Now, lots of people, not surprisingly, said method, the scientific method, is central to what we understand science. It's not a sufficient element of the definition because there are other aspects of science that are important to what science is, but it is a necessary one. So we have the scientific method, except for the fact, as we were repeatedly told, there's no such thing as the scientific method. There are various different constituent elements that make up what we generally call the scientific method that are more or less present in different scientific disciplines, such as falsification, repetition, hypotheses, control, so on and so forth. So you go down another level. And were you so minded, and we weren't because we were studying science rather than sort of the specific kind of details of what cosmological science might entail, you could go down a further level. In other words, if you are engaged in this process of disaggregating words, categories into their constituent elements, Then you have to disaggregate the constituent elements into further constituent elements. Now that's it's a very kind of fruitful process, but at some point or other, you have to talk, you have to use language, and this book would be literally unwritable if every time we used a word like science or religion, we had to qualify it endlessly by what we mean. In fact, our conversation, we will have already have used hundreds upon hundreds of abstract, socially mediated nouns and categories, all of which are question begging, all of which could merit an entire thesis of disaggregation, so on and so forth. That process is very useful. It's to quote T.S. Eliot, with whom I'm a great fan. It's an exercise, if you like, of purifying the dialect of the tribe, or it might be the language of the tribe. But ultimately, as he says somewhere else, I've got to use words. And so ultimately, while you do have to go, it's very helpful to go through this process of trying to understand what exactly do you mean by that. Let's investigate, let's disaggregate. At the same point, you do need a more essentialist, or if you prefer, a more holistic approach to this, because otherwise, we're simply not going to have a conversation.
Well, yeah, yeah, definitely. But it's like with the theory of everything, isn't it? Where poor people who work in that field or whatever dream of it, try to come up with an equation that is sufficiently simple as to encompass everything. On the other hand, to give account or account for details, which of course is what makes it such a challenging proposition. Uh, but in this case, given that you work on the ground, you localize, so to speak, the conversation, things are possible, and then we need to, yeah, for want of a better word, we need to use essentialist or whatever to take things for granted, but also be mindful of the fact that there are layers and layers and layers, and we need to dig up or disaggregate those layers and see what we mean when we say something or other.
As I said a little earlier on, language is discrete. Words are discrete. That's another way of saying they are fundamentally essentializing, because that's how they work. Discrete and essential are effectively similar terms for the same phenomenon there. It means simultaneously you have to use them, but as it were, you use them with caution. You use them with an awareness that it is more than possible. And this is the very fascinating point about language. Language is simultaneously an act of communication and miscommunication. And I will be communicating certain things to you that you will grasp through my use of discrete language and terms and so on and so forth. But I should also be cognizant of the fact there is a great capacity for misunderstanding there, because I will be using words in such a way that will be unfamiliar to you, or that may not come from your tradition in the same way, or may not mean language's usage may not be used in the same way. And that is fundamental to my point that so much of the debate, argument, tension around science and religion comes from unexamined linguistic concepts, unexamined use of terms.
And this is such a fertile ground for theologians. Maybe you know, you don't know. I'm just a theologian or theologically trained person, and my interest in the sciences is let's say popular level. So I can't grasp those hardcore concepts of check and test and validate or invalidate stuff, which is something any theologian should be mindful of instead of trying to teach scientists how to do science. Uh, but as a theologian, I find it fascinating, and I'm certain that the theologically minded or trained viewers will appreciate this aspect of the conversation. It's the fact that precisely because you address the topic of, let's call it etymology, what do we mean when we say this or that, uh, this rings a bell. This is the entire history of Christianity, or Christian theology rather, as a way of cogently reflecting on whatever we think we know or want to articulate about certain objects. And it's all about specifying, clarifying, discriminating the meaning of certain terms, so much so that in time theologians manage to kill each other for the purpose of securing the true understanding of words. Uh, do you see such uh, a risk or a danger in your undertaking, for example, to uh, dig so deep in search of meanings, uh, to the extent that then it's all about I don't know, it can degenerate into a conflict of meaning making um, and stuff like that.
So I absolutely see the danger there, but I think in what we are doing here, it is diffused by the idea of language as usage, which is extremely frustrating for people who want to have a clear and final, exhaustive, closed definition of any term. But the principle that it is impossible to define, to understand and define a term without paying attention to those who are using it means that this is always an open conversation. It's always an open-ended conversation. Now, it may turn out to be the fact that you and I use the same term, and we use it in very different ways. So there is still a great deal of potential for argument there. But when we are talking about the disagreement being in the different ways we use the term, it automatically becomes a more dynamic conversation because then you have to justify and explain why you are using the term in this way. What is the justification for using the term in this way? What is the possibility for using the term in other ways? If conversely, you have an understanding of language which is based more around definitive, so to speak, as it were, dictionary definitions, it becomes a harder edged and more static conversation because I say to you, you are getting it objectively wrong. And you say to me, I am getting it. You, Nick, are getting it objectively wrong. And that is, to pick up your kind of colourful point earlier, that's when people start killing one another, or at least disagreeing very violently, because my error then is an absolute objective error. And if you want to push it to an extreme, a denial of a truth. Whereas if we're talking about the way that I use language, the way I'm using the term, the way I'm deploying the term, as I said, it is a more open-ended, a slightly more flexible and fluid conversation that we are able to have. Doesn't mean, as I said, doesn't mean there aren't disagreements there, but it means that at least there's the possibility for negotiation in those disagreements.
And perhaps room for a more complementarian approach to things because uh, we are committed to certain meanings and we have grown up perhaps within cultures that sort of well, all cultures are meaning making, and we are more or less consciously conditioned by our framework and stuff like that. And therefore, even when we use the same words for like science or religion, yeah, your examples, those words resonate differently within us because of our own backdrop. So, what, as a matter of fact, essentialism would present as objectivity, or at least an objective discourse, in reality is the objectivity that is allowed by my own subjectivity or the parameters of my own framework, which is again an invitation to some kind of, let's call it, ecumenical mentality that accommodates more meanings than one when it comes to the word science or the word religion or the interaction between them.
Yeah, I think that's right. So here's a concrete example of what that might look like in practice. As I mentioned, we disaggregated science into six different sort of subcategories and then subsequently disaggregated those. There are different ways of slicing this cake. These are obviously not definitive sort of subcategories. But one of those six, as I mentioned, was presuppositions. So one of the things that defines, in inverted commas, what science is the philosophical, the metaphysical presuppositions on which it is based. And very often that was defined as naturalism. Other terms were used, physicalism, sometimes scientism, occasionally materialism with reservations, but naturalism tended to be the most popular idea of the metaphysical presupposition underpinning the scientific, underpinning science. At the other end of the discussion, we disaggregated religion. Again, lots of different ways of cutting the cake. For us, we found we most fruitfully split it into five areas, which were transcendence, belief, commitment, the formalization of belief in theology and doctrine, and fifthly, the formalization of commitment in rituals, laws, and offices. Again, a lot going on there. The one I want to pick up there is transcendence. So one of the disaggregated categories to understand, help us understand what religion is its belief in some form of transcendence. Now, again, terribly slippery word, lots of different terms were used. Some people would define transcendence as a belief in the supernatural. But here's the problem. If you define science as having a commitment to naturalism, and then define religion as having a commitment to supernaturalism, boom, the work is already done for you. And by definition, they're antagonistic. But then if you try to probe people, what do you mean by naturalism? Remarkably often, people define naturalism as not supernatural. And vice versa. You ask people what supernaturalism is, it's something that isn't natural. So they're not definitions, or at least not helpful definitions. They're juxtapositions. They become tautologous, if effectively. And if you engage in the process of understanding what their naturalism is understood to be, and you start passing between, say, for example, methodological naturalism and ontological naturalism. So you go down to the next level, and then you pass what you mean by transcendence. And very often, many of the people we spoke to didn't like the idea of transcendence being that of a different interventionist, supernaturalist conception of transcendence. You begin to nudge, or you move away from that reductive zero-sum game, science is naturalistic, religion is naturalistic, to a more nuanced science has a commitment to certain forms of naturalism. Religion has a commitment to certain forms of belief in the transcendent. There's still some negotiating to be done there. It's by no means straightforward. This is one of the tension points that remains, but you have at least moved away from that reductive zero-sum approach whereby one is effectively defined by not being the other.
And as a matter of fact, if I could bring this close to home, my home, as in Orthodox Christianity, when your idea of, in this case, my idea of the natural and the supernatural actually isn't Western, that's what makes Orthodox Christianity a different brand of Christianity altogether. When what the West calls the supernatural is a category that has to do with nature itself, it's an attribute of nature, so to speak, then of course the already, let's again using my word, the ecumenicity of your approach becomes even more obvious because disaggregating, to use your word, the term science and religion and disentangling them from the usual connection with naturalism on the one hand, supernaturalism on the one hand, when we realize that both the sciences and theology or religious convictions consider the same nature but do so differently, then we reach another level, isn't it? And it's not just the fact that they focus on different things, like, for instance, religion, yes, by dictionary definition refers to the supernatural and transcendent realities, whatever what the transcendent might be, because it's a lot of stuff, as you said there. Um, but instead of that, you realize that what you call religion or theological worldview or whatever, faith, convictions, and so on and so forth, it's all about expressing a different viewpoint on the same nature of things, which the sciences consider from a certain viewpoint. Would you agree that this is somehow a fruitful way of looking at this topic?
Absolutely. I'm 100% sold on complementarity, which I think is another word for what we're talking about here. Actually, there's a section in the second part of the book when we're looking at the chapter on metaphysics and when we're looking at precisely this issue, when I say, or I draw on some of the people we've been speaking to, and I say that actually a much more fruitful way of understanding this whole debate is not between the natural and the supernatural, but between the material and the spiritual, bearing in mind that material and spiritual does not simply map onto natural and supernatural, but it is much better understood as different perspectives on the same reality. So I'm absolutely sold on that. There are 2 points I think need to be made, though, in addition to that. The first is that it is very interesting that this whole part of our conversation underlines the significance of the broader kind of cultural and intellectual tradition within which we have the conversation. So, had we done this research and written this book entirely in a kind of more orthodox culture, we wouldn't have come across anything like the same number of objections in this particular area that we did. Because, as you say there, the blunt juxtaposition of natural and supernatural is not really very deep embedded within Orthodox cultures in the same way it is in Catholic and even more Protestant ones. In a similar way, I mean, self-evidently, if we were having this conversation, if we've been doing this research in a Buddhist culture, it would have been completely different. If we were having this conversation in a non-Anglophone culture, lots of people pointed out to me that, look, if we were having the conversation in a German-speaking language, that because of their concept of Wissenschaft and natural Wissenschaft, and the idea that many, many more intellectual disciplines can be labeled sciences than simply natural sciences, the idea that there was this inherent conflict there just is less natural to a German-speaking world because the language doesn't orient it in that way. Actually, as it happened in an Anglophone world, if you scroll back a few hundred years or so, it was perfectly understandable to have sciences in the earlier sense of the word. Theology was a science,
Yep.
history was a science. So it's just a point in saying that the cultural context, the linguistic and intellectual context in which you have this conversation hugely influences it. But the second point, going back to your point about complementarity, I'm fully sold on this, but um, what the book is insistent on is, as it were, not allowing us to have any what we sometimes call get out of jail free cards. So I'm absolutely convinced on complementarity, but each of the concluding 4 chapters, one on metaphysics, one on method, one on anthropology, one on politics and public discourse, ends with a short section called Outstanding Questions, which lists what it thinks are, as it were, the remaining tension points. It does quite a lot of bridge building in the chapter, but it says that there are still questions here to be asked. And whereas complementarity, I think, has a lot going for it, I don't think it quite gets you all the way there with regards to some very difficult questions around what's sometimes known as complete causal closedness, or closed causality. This is moving away from the conversation of naturalism and supernatural and the fundamental conception that does science depend on complete causal closeness or complete closed causality? And does religion depend on, does it have to countenance the idea of some form of intervention within that reality, which goes against the grain of that reality, which is a direct intervention by God, for want of a better argument. Now, we can pass that lots of different ways, but I guess what I'm saying is that even if you hold to a view, a complementarity view, which I do, there are still some interesting and challenging conversations to be had.
Yeah, which reminds me of your Magisteria, where you say, well, that there's no point in hiding the truth, the historical truth that there have been clashes and upon clashes and upon clashes, and we are still living in this kind of culture of clashes, which of course clashes, as you just explained, uh, um, originating in very different understandings of reality. And we cannot simply bypass out of some kind of universal fraternity, fellowship, whatever drive to bypass the difficulties that are on the ground. And this is precisely where your book is so helpful because it lands us in reality, and instead of, trying to build more artificial bridges, articulations between the fields, we actually begin from the scratch. We take it back from the scratch, and we see what we mean by science, what we mean by religion, and then in a more cogent way, in a more realistic way, we can approach the topic of their possible interaction. How do they interact? Because they interact nilly-willy, isn't it? They do interact, yeah, all
Oh,
through
absolutely.
all through history.
Absolutely. Yeah, oh, absolutely. So the one of the targets in Magisteria was Stephen Jay Gould's idea of science and religion being non-overlapping Magisteria. Now, I did that with some trepidation because I thought Stephen Jay Gould was a beautiful writer, and his attempt at articulating non-overlapping Magisteria in the late 90s was born of a good intent. Um, and it was a better model than the one that he was taking aim at, which was the kind of proto-new atheist view that science and religion are competing explanations for the same material reality, which no serious theologian ever considered, but was gaining ground. It's still popular, but it really was an explanation or a cure that was um, almost as bad as, or medicine is almost as bad as what it was trying to cure, because the division between science into facts and religion into values, I mean, for a start, that doesn't make sense. There's too much kind of distinction there, and it denies the fact that repeatedly through history and indeed normatively, science and religion do overlap. Now, the big argument in Magisteria is that the area where they most frequently overlap and where there has historically been most tension is on the question of the human being and how we understand the human, and specifically who has got the authority to adjudicate on the nature of the human being. And it has been historically at times when one discipline or another, usually one scientific discipline, has made an entire land grab to define what it means to be a human being. Human beings are only, fill in the blank, they're only machines, or they're only evolved primates, or they're only subconscious desires, or they're only their genes, or they're only information patterns. And those are the times throughout history when religious believers, theologians, whoever have said, you can understand humans as machines, arguably, as primates, as genes, etc. But to reduce them to that is to deny precisely the complementarity that you're talking about there. Humans, any sentence that begins, human beings are only, should set a warning light
Mm.
running, because this is the remarkable beauty and glory of human nature is that human nature is quite feasible. In fact, it's necessary to understand it at lots of different levels. And that is why, arguably, you need both science and religion, or at very least, a panoply of different disciplines
Oh, yeah, definitely.
to understand what the human is. Because effectively, the lens through which you view the human will dictate what you end up seeing. And as soon as you believe that only your lens only the lens that you happen to be holding at the moment, only that lens is legitimate, then you are bracketing out a whole host of other legitimate interpretations of the human.
Yeah, which is why I have to confess this, and I do so from time to time. I'm a convert to transdisciplinarity in the Basarab Nicolescu kind of tradition, philosophical tradition, where it's actually not a matter of proving which point is more accurate than the other. It's a matter of establishing the competence of each perspective, each lens, to use your word, when we look at a given reality, a human being. Yeah, what's a human being, and you can look at the human being from the viewpoint of fundamental physics, and well, you can cross in other, as they do in the what's that, quantum biology now. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's way above my pay
Okay.
grade.
So you can look the human being from the physical or chemical viewpoint, biology, genetics, but also why not theology, spirituality, poetry, philosophy, theater, all the arts, and so on and so forth. And then you realize that the human being is irreducible to any given lens. And yeah, this is what makes me, let's call it a complementarian, or if you like, an ecumenist, when it comes to whatever objects we are considering, whether it's a human being, which is, of course, as you said, the most common and useful object to think of, or the universe, or whatever, a leaf and the river, and so on and so forth. And it can only enrich us. This is why it's so important. The work you do, on the one hand, drives us down to, let's say, the building blocks of what we mean by this or that, religion, science, and so on, sciences and religions, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, this, let's say, particular focused view of things helps us sort of amass all these tesserae and make a mosaic, out of all of them, so that we grasp reality better. Would this be, let's say, a practical application of what you're doing? I don't know about the success or the insuccess of this new avenue in science and religion. Only time will tell. But I believe that there's a lot of, let's call it practical or potential for applicability of your idea when it comes to making sense of, yeah, a human being, especially in our day and age when human beings are quanta, and we can treat them statistically.
Well, I give you a very concrete example of that because I wrote a chapter on it in the Playing God book that you mentioned earlier on. That very briefly took that central idea of Magisteria, which was that the science and religion conversation gets interesting, really interesting when it comes to the nature of the human. And it observes that science today has the ability to understand, manipulate, control, quote unquote, improve the human in a way that it never has done beforehand. And so Playing God looks at a series of these technologies, so like extreme life extension, genetic modification, so on and so forth, and shows that each of these disciplines, each of these technologies kicks up very significant questions, which science by definition is not capable of answering. However you define it, they're fundamentally ethical and kind of deep anthropological and metaphysical questions. And religion has answers to them, doesn't have the answer, has answers to them. One concrete example is mental health at the moment. So there has been in the last 30 years or so a really remarkable pharmacological turn in mental health treatment since the development of the second generation of antidepressants that were licensed at the end of the 1980s, the SSRIs, the specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And there is a well worked through physical, medical understanding of how antidepressant drugs and SSRIs help with mental depression. Now, as an aside, there are lots of assumptions there, and the research is not quite as encouraging as people think it is. But even park that caveat to the side, there is this firm belief scientific belief as well as popular belief that mental health problems can, should be treated pharmacologically. But that approach treats the human fundamentally and solely a material organism. It understands a mental health problem as a neurochemical imbalance within the organism, which is then treatable, in theory, by means of a neurochemical treatment. Humans can be understood in that way. Sometimes that is a perfectly sometimes that is a perfectly adequate and sufficient way of understanding humans. But humans are social beings as well. And so much of the mental health problems we suffer will be because of the relationships or the broken relationships we find ourselves in, or the positions of social insecurity, or indeed poverty that we find ourselves in. And I quote this at length in the book about how it is, surprise, surprise, there is a strong correlation between people suffering from adverse levels of mental ill health and not being able to pay their gas bill, worrying about their rent, being in abusive relationships, so on and so on and so forth. And so it is not to say that the pharmacological treatment of humans is illicit at all, but it is to say that it is limited, and that if you have a multi-level, multi-layered, or multi-dimensional understanding of the human, you will also be cognizant of the fact that one of the reasons why somebody may be going through a period of mental ill health is that they are in a period of severe financial instability or poverty, or they're going through a painful divorce, or whatever it is. That's a great example of your complementarity. All those things are perfectly compatible with the idea they have a temporary neurochemical imbalance in their brain. But if you only see that as the only interpretation, you will treat that without treating the things external to the organism that are creating this. So one very pithy little story to summarize this, which a friend told me a while ago. Woman goes to, apocryphal story, but I don't doubt it's happened somewhere. Woman goes to her doctor and says, I want to come off the antidepressants. And he says to her, why? Are they not working? And she says, no, 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 they're working absolutely fine. And he says, well, why on earth do you want to come off them then? And she says, because I'm still married to the same abusive idiot.
Yep.
And that's kind of summarizes it very neatly. And going back to your original question, that's why that multi-layered or multi-dimensional understanding of the human, that's one of the ways in which it can have a practical, positive outworking.
Yeah. 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 This is something that uh, yeah, we need to learn again and again, and this is, I believe, one of the most significant contributions, at least as far as I'm concerned, of this recent book and your overall discourse. Uh, and yeah, we need to recognize difficulties, and there. Yeah, they are. There are difficulties, but we cannot level the playing field, by ignoring them, going essentialist or other. But on the other hand, yeah, it's a matter of considering seriously all of these perspectives and what they can bring. I think there's a bit of utilitarianism that sort of tops up my complementarianism. Uh, we need to think in terms of usefulness and purposefulness of what we do, Um, I want to keep you longer. Do you have a few, let's say, highlights about this most recent book? Something that can whet the appetite of potential readers, current viewers of this recording.
There's so much in there. Let me just leave you with one, which is that we talked a little bit about language is usage. And so the question of who is using the words in which context is very important. The project, as I said, interviewed a lot of people who know an awful lot about the subject, scientists and philosophers and sociologists and theologians, so on and so forth. But it also interviewed a very large number of people, general public, UK public. Now, you can't ask the general public their questions about metaphysics or epistemology. It just doesn't work like that. But you can ask them some questions about how they understand science, how they understand religion. And then there are other studies that we draw on. And what comes across is incredibly importantly, is the extent to which the public understanding of science and religion is deeply embedded in media narratives, if you like. Um, Let me quote something here from the introduction. Public conceptions of science in the UK are usually embedded in progressive narratives tied up with science doing things like warning, healing, or predicting. By contrast, religion, and certainly specific religions, are also encountered as embedded in newsworthy narratives, although often ones that are problematic or even threatening. As a result, public conceptions of science and religion are usually weighted in different directions by their perceived ethical features. This is so important. When most people are talking about science, the vast majority of them will have minimal personal experience of science themselves, but we'll be talking about the most recent, implicitly, the most recent news item, which has begun. Scientists have discovered that, or scientists are warning that. When they're talking about religion, they will implicitly have in the back of their mind the conception that, I mean, bluntly, a terrorist act, religious terrorists have done X or Y, or an abuse scandal has been exposed in this particular religious group. And so this ethical and public dimension is absolutely central to any conversation around science and religion. So that's why in the concluding chapters, there's one on metaphysics, there's one on method, there's one on anthropology, which is central, but there's also a question on public discourse and public ethics, because um, that is central to actually the whole science and religion conversation. And people will complain about, well, yes, but it's just the popular view. But the popular view really, really matters. And the way in which science is conceived as a fundamentally progressive enterprise, and religion a bit more varied, but often as regressive or reactionary. They are dominant features in the public mind. Now, I'm really pleased to say John Evans from the University of San Diego was another influence on the book, and he's done some great work on this area. And he and Elaine Howard Eklund are kind of increasingly focusing on this factor, this wider social, public, ethical dimensions to the science and religion debate. I think there's an enormously fertile research area there, because it's basically 90% of the field, 90% of the landscape, if you like. It's just that we haven't been paying that much attention to it.
Wonderful. And it's a wake-up call for all of us to be more mindful to what we consume by way of news.
Mm.
Discernment is of the essence again and again. Let me uh, finish by once again drawing attention to our viewers to Dr. Nick Spencer and Dr. Hannah Waite's latest book, The Landscapes of Science and Religion, from Oxford University Press, where the viewers become readers, as I have become a reader of this book, will find, well, another way to Wonderland. Thank you very much, Dr. Nick Spencer. It has been a pleasure, an honor, and thank you, a privilege.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.